So we're still talking about the biosphere. So I'm just going to remind you what the biosphere is. The biosphere is all of the place around the surface of the earth and in the water where life can exist. It could be the land, the water, or the air. So that's lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere. So I'm just referring back to the very beginning of chapter 1 where we talked about what the parts would have been. But the biosphere is where life exists. And so we're going to talk about ecosystems, not just one food chain or one food web, but the interaction between multiple things that would affect the living organisms that are there. So we'll start by talking about the characteristics of an ecosystem. Characteristics, when we're talking about ecosystems, could be classified as either biotic or abiotic. Now, hopefully you recall that when bio is part of a word, it is referring to things that are living. So biotic factors or biotic characteristics would have to do with living organisms. So when I ask for a biotic characteristic of some organism's ecosystem, what I really mean is what are the other organisms that would exist in this same place. Now, abiotic characteristics, because it starts with an A, science words that start with A usually mean not. So abiotic means not living. And so we would think of factors that are not other living organisms that would affect an organism's available to live, or an organism's possibility of living, of reproducing, of surviving. So I put a couple of examples here, water and minerals. But there are many things that are not living that would affect the survival of an organism. And so what I'd like us to do is take a minute and think about 3 sample organisms so that we can generate some suggestions for the biotic and the abiotic category. So I'm actually referring to a question that comes from your textbook. You don't necessarily have to get your textbook out for this because I've written it down. But what I'm asking is, could we think of, plural, some biotic and abiotic components for 3 different organisms? The 3 organisms are pronghorns. Now, you may or may not be aware of what a pronghorn is, and this is where if you wanted to look in your textbook to see a picture of them, you could. I'll just read you the little description. A pronghorn are found in southern Alberta. This is the northern extent of their distribution in North America. At one time, there were herds of close to 40 million pronghorn in North America. Now there are fewer than 30,000. What factors might affect their distribution and abundance? Which is really where we're going with this discussion. So we're thinking, what could affect the possibility that a pronghorn, and if you look, they look like deer, they're like little antelope type creatures. We're asking what could affect their survival. Humans is the next one. Now, you are all one of those, so that should be fairly familiar. And starfish, let's focus on the fact that they are aquatic, that they spend most of their time in the ocean. And so what I'd like for you to do is take the next few minutes and we'll make a little sort of chart where we have pronghorns, human, starfish, biotic and abiotic factors. And I'd like for you to try to think of at least 2 things for each category for each organism. So abiotic factors would be things that are not living that could affect the survival, that could affect how many of this organism there are. Biotic factors would be other organisms that would exist in this particular organism's ecosystem as part of perhaps their food chain. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's in their food chain. It could be another organism that's affecting them in some other indirect way. So I'd like you to try to think of examples like that too. So we're going to pause. So we'll start with the pronghorn. Let's start over on this side of the room. Cassidy, why don't you give me one of your biotic factors? Photosynthetic organisms. Now, you could put photosynthetic organisms in any one of these categories and have a point. Photosynthetic organisms affect basically everything else that could exist in a food chain. They are the source, they are the spot where energy enters the food chain. So because that is where energy enters the food chain, of course, they are going to affect every other living organism, whether it's directly because that organism comes next in the food chain, or whether it's indirectly. Now, I'm just going to make a point here that sometimes a biotic factor could also influence an abiotic factor. And so I noticed as I walked around that a lot of people had oxygen as an abiotic factor, and you are correct. Oxygen is a gas. It is not alive. Organisms require it to survive, but I want you to see the link between a photosynthetic organism and oxygen. Not only are they a food source, but they are affecting oxygen supply as well. Kendall, let's hear one of your things for pronghorn. How about an abiotic one? Ooh, I like both of those. So we have temperature and we have precipitation. Now I'm just going to put the word I told you to be more specific about, the word climate. Climate affects organisms. The temperature that it is, the amount of precipitation that there is, will affect whether or not the organism can survive. Now, is temperature going to directly affect the pronghorn itself? Is precipitation going to directly affect the pronghorn itself? Probably not necessarily. They could find shelter, but temperature and precipitation will affect the growth of photosynthetic organisms. So I want you to notice that there's always a link. Abiotic factors are not separate. They're simply the non-living side of what living organisms do or create while they're part of the environment. Now let's move on to the human section and hear what some people's examples were there. Why don't we start with Nick? Why don't you tell me what you had for a biotic thing? Absolutely, trees. So we could repeat photosynthetic organisms for all of these categories, even though a tree is probably not what we're going to eat. Don't get me wrong, you could. There's things that you can eat that are made from trees. But a tree could also do things like provide shade to us. And so we already mentioned that photosynthetic organisms provide energy and oxygen, but they can do more than that. They can protect us from things that would otherwise harm us. So I'm just going to put the word protection. So organisms don't have to necessarily be providing food or nutrients to be affecting another organism's life. They could be providing shelter or protection. Let's go with Brittany. Why don't you tell me what your abiotic human thing was? Now, absolutely water. Not just whether or not it's raining, but the amount of water that's available. And I'll maybe make some points here. What type of water is it? Is it fresh water or salt water? Because that makes the difference. Fresh water is water that you can drink, and salt water generally is not. It could be the water temperature. So we mentioned temperature in general, but water temperature has a huge effect on the amount of oxygen that can be found in water. And so this would be not necessarily for a human specifically, because we're generally not breathing underwater, but the amount of oxygen would affect what can live in the water. We could also say the movement of water, so not just whether or not it's there or what kind it is, but its actual movement. We could talk about things like erosion, and how rivers flowing can change the shape of land, which can indirectly affect where I can live. For example, I used to live in Edmonton, and there are a lot of houses, much like there are in Calgary, built right on the edge of the river valley. And I remember watching on the news a humongous giant mansion crashing into the river valley because the edge of the cliff had slowly eroded and there was no longer enough support for that. You might remember when the floods happened here, a lot of houses that back right onto the Elbow River, and if you've ever floated down the Elbow River, you've seen there's some really, really nice houses there, but they are very close to the water, some of them. Some of them are farther back and weren't as affected, but some people's houses were so close to the water that when the river flooded, it washed away some of the support for their house. And so water can be good, but water can be bad too. So don't forget that the things that are on this list don't have to necessarily be things that are helpful. They can be things that are harmful. So someone over here, Courtney, I think it was you. You have a nice harmful thing in this human biotic category. Diseases. So diseases, for the most part, are caused by living organisms. Now, it's true that some conditions are caused by a virus, which is not technically a living cell, but a lot of diseases are passed by bacteria or are transmitted by other human beings. And so diseases, and I'll even include this word here, parasites. A parasite is something that requires a host to survive. So it requires probably energy source or a place to live. So if you think about parasites for humans, you would think about, it's usually small organisms that are insect-like in nature, ticks and things like that. Lice would be one. Dogs can get heartworm. Dogs can get fleas. Those would all be examples of parasites. So those things would be negative in the biotic category. Now, I know a bunch of people had another thing in the human category. Kate, I think you have it. What was one of your biotic factors in the human category? Other humans. So, I would like to mention in the human category that, of course, humans affect other humans, not just because of food chain interactions, because that does happen. Cannibalism is a thing, not a common thing, but a thing. But let's think about how humans compete. Now, in any one of these categories, I could have put that same organism. So in the pronghorn category, I could have put other pronghorns. And in the starfish category, I could have put other starfish. Because realistically, if we are the same species and we have the same needs, we are going to compete for resources with each other. And so that's one aspect of how humans affect other humans. Now, humans affect other humans in a bunch of other ways too. For example, humans kill other humans. Sometimes for no particular reason that is evident to the outside world. And so humans in all three categories might be the reason that an organism dies, and it's not because we're part of their food chain. The other thing that I'd like to mention in the humans section is that we do a lot of things that affect abiotic characteristics. Humans do a lot of things that cause pollution, things that cause destruction. So I'm being really general here, but for example, we burn things. Burning things produces CO2 and other gases that could be harmful to the environment. We destroy environments. So I think it was, Jocelyn, you asked me about this. Do you want to tell me about your example of something a human did that they did, but then it was abiotic? If a human was to create a fire, so the human is a biotic thing, but the actual fire, forest fire that's the result, would be an abiotic characteristic. But that's how humans can affect abiotic factors. Other examples of destruction would be things like us cutting down trees to build more houses, etc. Now let's go on to the starfish, and let's hear, how about one of you guys? How about Julianne? What do you got in your starfish biotic category? They have a brain, that's true, but for biotic, we really have to think of something that's alive all by itself. So starfish do have a brain, but we would want to focus on what about that is affecting it. So if we say the starfish itself, I think that you are right. It has a brain. It can think about things. Someone on the other side, Maddie, I think it was you, you said something about how it feels or what its state of mind is, and then you laughed, and I said, well, no, I think you could be right, because the starfish itself has a brain, or that's pretty loose for a starfish here, about its nervous system. But we're thinking about how the organism has some control. And so there are a lot of organisms that can respond to their environment, that can make choices, that can do things that will affect their probability of survival. So if we think about behavior, behavior affects an organism's ability to survive. You might remember learning, it's a grade 9 topic usually, where you talk about adaptations organisms have. And adaptations can be both morphological, so about their physical structure, or behavioral, so about what they're actually doing. So for example, I'm trying to think of what starfish actually do. They don't do a whole lot. But in lots of organisms, whether or not you have a mating song or whether or not you can perform the right dance will determine if you get a partner and can reproduce. Whether or not you are strong or weak might determine if you could win the competition between you and another member of your species, or even you and a member of another species that's fighting over the same resource. So the starfish has a brain or some sort of control, which means that that affects its behavior. And the behavior of that organism itself is absolutely a biotic thing that is affecting their survival. Let's hear from someone up here. How about Shay? Why don't you tell me what your abiotic thing was in starfish? Did you have one or no? Yeah. It's okay. Now, you're saying it's silly, but you're not. Rocks have minerals in them, and minerals are required for growth and for survival. Now, rocks could be affecting them in another way too. Rocks affect water flow. Rocks could also act as a habitat of sorts for them. So rocks do a lot of things. Water flows over them, and we saw, like in the phosphorus cycle, as rain falls, phosphorus is dissolved in water, and that's how it enters food chain. Rocks can direct the flow of water, allow or prevent it. We know that if you've walked in the Sheep River Valley since it flooded, you'll see all sorts of new rock walls that have been erected to try to prevent water from flooding out areas. And rocks can additionally act as a habitat or shelter or protection for organisms. So a few of you have laughed when you said your examples, but I hope you see that basically anything that is in an organism's ecosystem affects them. It would be hard for me to find something that didn't somehow affect the organism, whether it was direct, like it was immediately perilous for their survival, or perhaps it was indirect, like it might take a long time or it might affect another organism. Now, something like this, I hope you can see, it would be hard for me to ask you to memorize some sort of official list of what are the biotic characteristics of a human's environment. I would ask you, for example, to classify. So I could give you some characteristics and ask you, are they biotic or are they abiotic? I could ask you if they would help or hinder the organism. But what very probably I would ask you to do is something of a written question format where I would talk about an organism or tell you an organism and ask you to explain a factor. Now, if I asked you to explain a biotic or an abiotic factor for an organism, I would want you to tell me why or how it affects them. And so the way I was going through this list and saying why that might be the case, that would be the kind of thing that you could say. So if I was going to ask you in written form, I would ask you why or how. And this is the spot where it might not necessarily be something that I said to you in this unit of this class. You could be accessing prior knowledge that you have, things that you've learned before, things that you just know from your life. So for example, when I walked around right at the beginning, Jack told me that he was hunting and he shot a pronghorn last year. And so he knew right away that he was a biotic factor in their environment. So it can come from your own personal experience. And so if I ask you about an organism and its environment, I'll always pick one that you should be familiar with. So I'm not going to pick one that you've never heard of or that you don't have some basic knowledge of. I tend to pick organisms that live where we live, so there's a realistic chance that you've seen one or come into contact with one. So if you think about where we live really close to the mountains, so I usually pick organisms that live in or around mountains. I'll also pick organisms that are familiar to you in general, like a dog or a cat, or something that is so commonplace that it would exist in most of our ecosystems. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask about biotic and abiotic factors? So, our next goal is to talk about if I'm thinking about these factors and how they might affect an organism, what can I look at? How do I know if an organism is affected by a particular factor? And so our goal is to talk about these 4 words and what the relationship is between them. And the reason that we'll talk about these 4 words is because they are different levels that an ecologist could study to figure out how biotic and abiotic factors are affecting the growth and the distribution of either one organism or a whole group or a whole species. So we will start with species. So the overarching topic here is levels of study for ecologists. And this is so that we can ask ourselves, what is the effect of each of these biotic and abiotic factors? Now, the first thing you have is the definition of what a species is. A species are members of a population that can reproduce together to produce fertile offspring. So I know when I used to teach junior high, I would always talk about an example of something that could reproduce but did not produce fertile offspring. There are lots of organisms that physically have the ability to reproduce with each other. So for example, a horse and a donkey are physically similar enough that they can reproduce. The result is a mule, which is generally infertile. So we would not consider this to be a distinct species because it cannot, it's not fertile. Now, when members of a population reproduce together and produce fertile offspring, fertile means that their offspring can reproduce, then that's the definition of a new species. And so depending on who you talk to and who you ask, Sometimes we're right on the verge of declaring that two organisms are separate species. The idea of species really has to do with the history over time. And so because that's changing, sometimes things that are not considered a separate species right now will actually be considered that in the future, because we'll see that over a number of generations, this is true. So when we are studying a species, the thing that I want to focus on are the questions the ecologist would ask. So we're focused on one specific type of organism. So we're asking ourselves what biotic or abiotic factors affect this one specific type of organism. We really have to focus on abiotic conditions. And that's because when we're focused on one organism, we're not thinking about its interactions with other organisms yet. That's what one of the next levels will be. So some examples would be, what adaptations does the organism have? Or perhaps, why is the organism's distribution the way it is? So I'll focus on a couple of example organisms here to show you what I mean. If we're focused on a species, we would be talking about one specific type of plant or animal. On the left, I have a picture of just one type of flower. It's called an old man of the mountain flower. And so if I mention a specific type of organism, that means we are at the species level. On the right, these are the snails that exist in the Banff Springs. It's a particular species of snail. So there's one plant and one animal. And you'll know that we're at the species level because, like, I'll be really blunt, like this is this particular type of organism. So we could ask ourselves, what does this organism have that's allowing it to survive? So for example, the Banff Springs snail tolerates heat really well. That's an adaptation that it has. So that's something about it specifically. So that would be a biotic factor. What would be a good abiotic factor to explain the organism's distribution? Well, you might be aware, because I mentioned it previously, that a lot of natural hot springs are coming from heat that's under the surface of the Earth. And so there is usually a lot of sulfur involved in this type of thing, and usually organisms that live in that type of environment really enjoy sulfur, use it for a lot of things. Chemosynthesis might be happening there. So we have a biotic factor, an adaptation of the organism, or an abiotic factor. For the old man of the mountain, we could talk about things that the plant itself has to help it survive. And so we might talk about, for this old man of the mountain, which is a flower that lives, like its name suggests, on mountains, it is fairly drought tolerant. So it's good at conserving water. That's a property that it has. It's one of its adaptations. A thing that's abiotic that might affect this particular plant is altitude, because it's on a mountain. So for both organisms, we gave a biotic and an abiotic thing that would affect that species specifically. And so this is very similar to what we did with the pronghorn, the starfish, and the human, but we're being very specific about one species. So that's the most specific level when you're talking about just one type of organism. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask about species or biotic and abiotic factors that affect them? So then the next two levels I like to talk about at the same time so I can show you what the difference is between them. The next level is a population. I'm going to add the word many here. A population refers to many, like several, more than one, member of the same species that are in a defined area at a specific time. In other words, they live together. Now, when I'm talking about a species, I'm not talking about right now, right here, today, how is that flower surviving? I'm talking about, in general, that type of organism. But a population is different. A population is a specific group of one species that live together, same time, same place. And so when we think about biotic and abiotic factors that influence a population, we need to think about the size of the population. Is it changing? And what's the nature of the population? In other words, what is the makeup? Is it all organisms with one particular type of characteristic, or has it shifted? So I'm going to talk about a few different examples that would help illustrate this. So over here on the left, we have some lilies. They're my favorite. I love them. I think I somehow decided that since I was born in May and that lily of the valley was the flower for May, that it was going to be my favorite flower forever. But lilies are an example of a plant. Now, I don't want to focus on a characteristic of the lily itself. I want to talk about this group of lilies specifically. And so if I ask myself, why are there so many in the spring specifically? And specifically, we'll say that they are in my yard. Why are there so many lilies in the spring, but so few in the winter? Whoops, I was going to write water, not winter. And so you might laugh and say, well, silly lady, do you not know that things die in the winter? And I would say, well, of course. So let's mention things like temperature and precipitation. Those two factors will affect how big my crop of lilies is, whether there is a lot of them or whether there are few of them. And so one of the things we're focused on is the size of the population, and the fact that it changes during seasons would be a really good example of how to study an abiotic factor that affects a population. Now, if we talk about the nature or the makeup, what we're really talking about is the variety of the population. So if you take a look, I tried to illustrate there people with different tones of skin, meaning that all human beings are not of the same exact race. And so we would ask ourselves, what kind of factors would influence the variety of humans that there are? And if you think about this, this would be something that you'd have to study over a long period of time because it takes a while to make a new human. But you might talk about behavior here. It would be a biotic factor that would influence this. But for example, people traveling and moving to different parts of the world, more or less, could influence the makeup of our entire human population because it would either limit or perhaps increase the number of people who are reproducing with members of other races but still same species. Now, the organism in the middle is called a collared pica, and their population is an example of one that declined dramatically. Like all of a sudden, there were large numbers of them, and then their population decreased. And so we ask ourselves, what would be the reason for this? The researchers who have been studying them hypothesize that it is global warming that has actually contributed to the smaller number in the population of this particular species. So that would be an example of an abiotic factor that's probably caused by biotic things like humans. Now the next level is community, A community is similar to population, but with one big difference. A community is several populations of different organisms. So that means different species that exist in the same area. So now we're not just talking about other organisms of my same species and how many of us there are, but how do we interact with other types of species? So the things that we would ask ourselves in the community category would be, for example, how many populations are there? In other words, how many types of organisms live in this particular spot? And we could ask ourselves about interactions. How do different populations interact with each other? Those things could be biotic or abiotic factors that are affecting the number and the types of communities that exist. So over here, where I say how many populations are there, I'm showing you the difference between a forest and a fragment. Sometimes you'll see that what used to be a huge forest gets fragmented because of deforestation, because of forest fires, because of erosion and water running through it. But when you see a huge population versus a bunch of small populations that are fragmented, you could ask yourself, what kind of factors would cause that to happen? So a biotic factor could be humans cutting them down. An abiotic factor could be a fire. Lots of fires are started simply because it's dry outside, and so it doesn't have to necessarily be a human. If we talk about populations interacting with each other, we could ask ourselves, especially here, how does competition affect population types, population sizes? And specifically, we would be thinking about competition between species. So in my pictures on the side, on the top, I have a couple of organisms fighting, probably over a mate. But on the bottom, I have a hyena and a lion fighting over who is going to get to eat the dead animal. So that's two different species competing over what they're going to eat. The other thing that I want to mention and remind you of is the idea of productivity. We know that sunlight and water availability are the things that determine basically whether or not a plant can grow, and that since all other organisms depend on plants, these two factors, sun and water, could be abiotic factors in literally every category, every level of study that we could discuss. So we have a species where we talk about just one type of organism, a population where we're asking ourselves how many of them, or are they all different? Communities where we're asking ourselves how many different types of organisms live and interact with each other. And then finally, our last category, ecosystem. An ecosystem is the biggest level. It's where we're looking at the most things. And in an ecosystem, we are focusing on the interaction of biotic and abiotic components. So I was glad that someone mentioned a fire as one of their examples, because it's my example here. In my example, there is a forest fire. A forest fire, we'll just say, is abiotic, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a human that started it. So after this abiotic thing happens, organisms that live well in open spaces establish themselves. That is a biotic thing. Now that biotic organism that will establish themselves, usually like small plants and bushes and things like that, they create shade, alter soil, which is an abiotic characteristic, and this makes the environment more suitable for other organisms, which is biotic. Now this is just one example, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that abiotic factors affect biotic ones, and vice versa. Biotic factors affect abiotic ones. And the idea is that things change over time. If one factor in the species or the population or the community or some other biotic factor changes, it can make the environment, which is all of our abiotic factors, more or less suitable for other organisms. So if we were going to sum this up, species is the most specific. And in a species, we are talking about biotic things. How does this organism survive? What affects its life? In population, we're talking about biotic things again. But once we get to ecosystem, we have to consider living and non-living things as part of it. So what I'm trying to show there is that the definition of each thing contains biotic. The definition of an ecosystem also contains abiotic things.